One of my favorite things about working with Affinity Designer are QuickFX. QuickFX are basically non-destructive effects that can be applied to the objects on your canvas, whether they be vector-based or pixel-based. You can access the QuickFX menu over here on the right-hand side of your screen. You should see a tab titled QuickFX, and there's 10 of them in total. In this lesson, I'll be going over all 10 of these and demonstrating what they are and how they work. And if you don't see a QuickFX tab on your screen, just come up here to the window menu and look for QuickFX in the list and go ahead and click on that. So QuickFX are one of those quality of life features that makes Affinity really pleasant to work with. I use them all the time in my own design work. In fact, you can see in the thumbnail design for this video, I used a few of them. If you look over here in the layers menu, some of these objects have the FX icon next to them, meaning I have a quick effect applied. So let me open up a new document so I can show you how to use this feature. So if I come over here to the QuickFX tab, we have all 10 of these. I'm going to start with Bevel and Emboss. So I'm going to grab one of the shape tools and I'm going to click and drag on the canvas to draw a shape. And I'm going to change the color of this shape. Let me go to the color tab and change this to something like blue. And then I'll come over here to the QuickFX, make sure you have the object selected, and I'm going to tick the box right there to apply the effect. And now we have these two sliders. We have opacity and we have radius. And this basically just applies a bevel effect to the object, and you can increase the radius, which intensifies the effect, or you can decrease it, which does the opposite. And then you have the opacity slider, which allows you to control the opacity of the effect. You get even more controls though if you click on this gear icon though. If you click on that, you'll see we get this menu that pops up. Mine opened on my other screen. Let me grab that. There we go. And if you notice, we have some more sliders that we can work with. We have both radius and depth, which are linked together. If we click this link icon, we can decouple them, and now we can change them independent of each other. So I can increase the depth, but decrease the radius, and you can see the difference there. And then we have a soften slider, which we can increase as well. We can increase the softness of it or decrease it. And then over here, you could change the direction of the lighting. So if I were to take this little circle inside of the larger circle and move it around, that basically controls the light source. So you can see as I move that around, the appearance of the effect changes. And then over here, you can change the color of the highlight and the shadow. So by default, we're working with a white highlight, which you can see over here on this edge, and a black shadow, which you can see in the black areas going around the outside and the inside. And if you want to change the color of those, just click on it and you can change the color like that. So let me place that back to white. And finally, up here, we have the type. By default, it has pillow selected. You can also choose Emboss, which looks like that. You can choose outer, which only applies it to the outside of the object. And then you can apply inner, which only applies it to the inside of the object. So I'm going to set this back to pillow. And one thing I wanted to point out, you'll see this with all of the QuickFX. Down here at the bottom left of the Layer Effects menu, you'll see this Scale with Object option that's disabled by default. Now the way this works is if I take this object and scale this down, you'll notice that the effect becomes more intense. That's because although I'm scaling the object, the effect remains the same size. It doesn't scale the size of the effect. So as I change the object, the effect changes. So if you want to maintain the appearance of the effect, if you want to lock it in, I would recommend ticking that box. And now when you scale the object, the appearance of it will be maintained because the effect is scaling along with the object. Okay, so let me uncheck that. Let me close this. And another thing I wanted to show you about QuickFX, let me scale that down a little bit. If I come back over here to the Layers menu, you can now see that we have the effect applied here. I'm going to right-click this object and go to Copy. And I'm going to grab the Circle tool, and I'm going to draw a circle, and I'll make this one a different color. And if I want to apply the same quick effect to this object that I have on this object, I could just go to Edit and choose Paste Effects. And now that same effect is pasted in there without having to go and manually apply all those settings that we already set. So let me get rid of that. And if you want to remove the quick effect, you could just deselect the box and now it's gone. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it's a non-destructive effect. If you want to apply it again, just click on it and there it is. Same settings as before, or you can disable it like that. Now let's have a look at the outline quick effect. So to demonstrate this one, I'm going to grab the text tool because this is really handy for creating text with an outline on it. In fact, whenever I want to create text with outlines, I just create the text in Affinity and I apply the outline QuickFX. So I'm going to add some text and let me change the font of this. I'll go with something like League Gothic. And I'm going to change the color of this text. Let me scale that up a little bit. I'm going to make this a light shade of gray and I'll zoom in on that. And I'm going to apply outline. And now I'm going to take this radius and increase it. And as you can see, it's just putting an outline around the outside of the object. This is similar to adding a stroke, but it's not quite as complex. It's a lot simpler and it's much quicker than adding a stroke. And it gives you a lot more options. So I'll show you that in just a second. So we have the color over here. We could change the color of the outline if you'd like. And then you could change the opacity of the outline as well. Where you really get the good settings though is if you click on the gear icon to open up the layer effects menu. And now we can change some other elements as well. So for example, the alignment. By default, the outline goes along the outside of the object. You can also place it around the inside or the center, which places it around, it places the outline halfway around the edge of the object. And then you can also place it around the inside. Now I'm going to have to lower the radius to be able to see. There we go. Now you could see the inner outline of it or the inline of it. And if you want to change the fill style, let me change this back to outside. Make it a little larger. And you could change the color of it over here, or you can also change the fill style. By default, we have solid color. You can also choose contour, which creates sort of like a gradient. Or you can just choose a regular gradient. And then with the gradient selected, you could choose the type of gradient you want to use, whether it be elliptical, radial, or conical. And I have a lesson on gradients if you want to check that out, if you want to learn more about how that works. But you can change these settings in here if you want. You can click on this swatch right here, and then you could just click on each end of the gradient and change the color of that gradient if you'd like. So I'm going to change those two colors. And then you can use this handle in the middle to change the offset. And then if you want to come over here, you could change the angle of the gradient as well. So now let's have a look at how to use the 3D Quick Effect. I'm going to grab my rounded rectangle tool and I'll click and drag to draw a shape. And I'm going to make this a different color. I'll go with blue. And I'm going to apply the 3D Quick Effect. And you can see we have the radius slider. If I bring this up, you can see it creates somewhat of a 3D effect, and you can change the opacity of that effect over here if you'd like. But we have much more controls in the settings menu. So let me click on the gear icon. And we have the radius and the depth, which are linked together by default. But if you deselect this link icon, you could change them independent of each other. So I can increase the depth, but decrease the radius, and we get more of like a harder edge there. So let me increase the depth some more. And then we end up with something like that. And then we can soften the effect over here if we'd like. By default, it's set to 0, but if you want to soften it, you can do that to make it look more smooth. And then over here we have the opacity. This is just the opacity of the effect. And then we have diffuse. Diffuse is the diffusion of the light going over it. If you bring it down, you'll notice it becomes darker. It's all the way up at 100 by default, so I'll just leave it up there. And then we have the specular. And then the shininess. You can increase or decrease the shininess of the object. And then the ambient as well. You can increase or decrease that. And then down here we have the direction, which is basically the light source. So if I move this around, you can see I'm moving around the light source of the object. Now the good thing about this, or the interesting thing about this, is that we can add additional light sources. So let me put this one up here. And right now you can see this is light source number 1, and there's only one light source. So I'm going to click the add button. And now we have light source number 2 selected, and we could change this light source. I'm going to put this over here like that, or maybe down a little more. And now we have more of a visible 3D effect because we have those two different light sources. And if you want to change the color of the light, you can use the color stripe over here. So I'm going to select light source number 1, and I'll change the color of this to something else like a pink shade. Or maybe I'll keep this one white, and then I'll change the color of the second light source. Let me try that instead and see how that looks. And then I'll change the location of this light source. And then we end up with something like that right there. And then I could take the radius and increase or decrease it. And just to give you an idea of how I'm using some of these quick effects, let me come back over here to my thumbnail design. If I click on this object right here, you can see I have the 3D quick effect applied to several of these objects. This object right here is a grouping of objects. And if you expand the group, you can see I have quick effects applied to the separate objects. That's another good thing about this tool. You can apply quick effects to entire groups, or you can apply it to individual objects within groups to create a more detailed effect like I've done here. And for this window right here, you can see the quick effect I have applied is outline. So if I come over here to the quick effects menu, well, I have outer shadow applied as well, but you can see I have outline. If I deselect that, you can see the outline's gone. But the outline adds some nice separation between that and the rest of the artwork. So I have that applied. Let me put that back on there. And there we go. That's just one example of how I like to use quick effects. Next up would be inner shadow. So let's take a look at how to use that. I'm going to grab my text tool and I'm going to create some text. And I'm going to leave this light shade of gray, maybe a little lighter. And I'm going to apply an inner shadow, or not, I clicked the wrong one, inner shadow, there we go. And I'm going to increase the radius. And you can see it's placing a shadow along the inside edge of the object. And I can change the opacity of the shadow using this opacity slider. And I can change the color of the shadow too if I'd like. I could change this to something else. Like if I wanted it to be red, I can create a red inner shadow. I'm going to leave mine black though. And then we have the offset. If I move this slider, you can see it's changing the offset of the shadow. It's moving it down to the right. And the reason why it's going down to the right is because of the angle setting, which is just beneath it here. It's set to 315 degrees. But if I move this around, you can see we're changing the direction of the inner shadow. Or if you don't want to use this, you could just click on the offset tool, and then you could just click and drag to manually place the inner shadow wherever you'd like it to be. And once that's placed, I will open up my settings menu to see the additional settings. And it looks like most of these are already there. The only one that's different is intensity. You can increase the intensity. That basically makes the shadow a little darker or a little sharper and less fuzzy. And then we have the blend mode up here. You could change the blend mode of your shadow if you'd like, which would be more useful if you were working with like a photo or a color-based image. Now let's have a look at how to use inner glow. To really see how this works, I'm going to create a black background for my canvas here. So let me draw a rectangle in the size and shape of the canvas. And let me just fix that. And I'm going to make this black, or maybe a really dark gray. And then I'm going to place some text on top of it. So I will create some text. And let me change the color of that so I can see it. There we go. And now I'm going to apply the inner glow. So I'll click on that button. I'll increase the radius. And you can see we now have an inner glow going around the inside edges of the object. And you could change the color of it as well using this slider if you want to try out a different color to use. And if you open the settings menu, we have a couple of other settings that we can change. We can change the intensity, which is the hardness of the glow, and then we can change the placement of it as well. By default, it's placed around the inner edge of the object, but if you wanted to place it around the middle of the object instead, you can flip that by clicking on that button right there, and now it goes along the inside of the object rather than the outer edges or the inner edges. So now let's have a look at how color overlay works. To demonstrate this, I'm going to import an image. So I'm going to open up my stock menu by going to Window and selecting Stock. And I'm going to place the menu over here. I'm going to choose Pixabay as my source, and I'm going to search for an image of a sunset. And I'm going to grab this image right here and place it on my canvas. And then I can close out of this menu. So the color overlay allows you to apply an overlay of color over the image, as the name would suggest. So let me just show you. I'll tick the box to enable it. And by default, we just have a solid black fill. I'm going to add a pink color to the sunset image just to intensify it a bit. So let me change this to a pink shade. And I'm going to bring down the opacity so you can see it better. This works really good when you use a really low opacity value. If you bring it up too much, you can see too much of the color in there. But if I bring it down ever so slightly, you can see it adds a little bit of warmth to the photo. So if I were to disable it, you can see the difference there. And you can get a much better effect if you open the properties menu and change the blend mode. So for this, let me increase this a little bit. I'm going to try out a few of these different blend modes here, and you can see how they all interact differently with the image. The one that worked well for this image was saturation, so I'll apply that, and I'll lower that just a little bit. And you can see it applies that pink color to certain areas of the image, and if I toggle it off, you can see the difference. That's how it looks before, and then once we apply that effect, we end up with something like that right there. And that just adds a nice touch to the image, I think. Or if you don't want to apply that effect, what you can do is just set the blend mode back to normal. And then you could just use it as a regular color overlay. So like, let's say you wanted to use this as a backdrop and you wanted to place some text on top of that. The text would be more easily legible with that color overlay because it doesn't let the background interfere with it too much. Okay, so now let's have a look at gradient overlay. For this demonstration, I'm just going to use the same image again. This works the same way as color overlay, only it uses a gradient rather than a single color. So let me select the image and apply it. And by default, we have this black and white gradient. I'm going to click the properties menu to open it. And we have our gradient source right here. I'm going to click on that. And we have our two different colors that we can change. You just have to click on each one to change it. So I'm going to change this one to that shade of pink that I was using. And then I'll change this one over here to something like yellow or orange or something like that. And if you want to change the offset of the gradient, you can do so with this center tab. Or if you want to add additional colors to this gradient, you could just click on, there you go, you could double click on it to add a new color. And then you could change the color of that section right there. Go with something like that. Or if you want to remove it, I don't quite like how that looks, so I'm going to delete it. And I'll use this just as it is. And I'm going to rotate this around a bit. And I'll set the blend mode to, I'll go with saturation again. And I'll bring down the opacity. And you can see we have more vibrancy in the image with that gradient overlay applied. And if I toggle it off, you can see the difference. That's what it looks like before, and then that's after. It's a very subtle difference, but it is a nice touch in my opinion anyway. So next up we have outer glow. So let me add a black background to my document here to apply this effect, to make it so that you can see it anyway. I'm going to apply a dark background, and I'm going to create some text. So let me click and drag, and once again I'll just use some sample text. And let me scale that down. And I'm going to apply outer glow. And I'll increase the radius. And you can see we have a glow going behind the object. And you can see why I applied that dark background. Up against a white canvas, you really wouldn't be able to see this. So let me change the color of this. Let me use something like a lighter shade of blue that's more consistent with this color. And I'll bring the opacity down. And you can see the effect a little better. In fact, I'm going to make this text white. And then I will increase this opacity here, and you can see it kind of creates like a little bit of a glowing effect. So if you want to create like a neon light sort of effect, which I do have a tutorial on this channel for doing that with Affinity if you want to check that out, this is the tool you would use right here. The outer glow makes that really handy. Okay, so next up would be outer shadow. This is basically a drop shadow, and it's really convenient to use because normally when you're working with vectors, you have to manually create a drop shadow by creating a duplicate object and applying a Gaussian blur to it. Affinity makes this really convenient though. So let me grab my text tool, and I'm going to write some text. And the text is white, but that's okay because I'm going to apply an outer shadow. And I'll increase the radius, and you can see the shadow going behind the object. We have the opacity setting here. We have the color of the shadow up here. So if you wanted to use a different shade, like blue, for example, I'll use a dark blue for this demonstration. And then we have our offset. You can bring this down and to the right, increase it some more, and you get the idea. And you can change the angle of it over here if you'd like. And if you want to open up the settings menu, we have a couple of additional settings as well. For one, we have intensify. You can make the shadow or the outer shadow a little darker, a little more sharp. And then you could change the blend mode of it as well if you'd like. And once again, going back to my own example here of the thumbnail I designed for this video, I applied the outer shadow quick effect to this object here. You can see if I toggle that off, it kind of gets lost against the background there. But if I turn that back on, you can see it creates a little bit of depth, a little bit of separation between this menu and the background that I have on top, beneath it. And then finally, we have Gaussian Blur. So let me import another photo to demonstrate this. I'm going to go to Window, and I'm going to choose Stock. And this time I'm going to look for Traffic Night. And I'm looking for a traffic at night sort of image. Okay, let me go with this image right here. I'm going to click and drag that onto the canvas. And this image is good because we got a lot of different colors in here that we can use. And let me close out of this. So if I apply the Gaussian Blur filter or quick effect, I can take this slider and bring this all the way up like that. And you can see it kind of like blurs the image or makes it look like it's out of focus. And that's really helpful if you're going to be using this as a backdrop and you're going to have other elements on top of it. And you don't want this background image to draw too much tension away from the foreground. So it would be useful to apply a Gaussian blur. And then down here where it says preserve alpha, if you notice here, if I deselect this image, it didn't just blur the image, it blurred the edges of the image too. So it kind of looks soft. It's not as well defined around the edges. If I click on preserve alpha, you can see it retains the hard edge of the image. So the boundary is maintained and you can just blur it as needed like that without it affecting that. So that is how you can go about working with QuickFX in Affinity Designer. If you want to see a lesson where I use QuickFX to create something, be sure to check out my tutorial where I demonstrate how to create this realistic looking wax seal out of nothing but vector objects and QuickFX in Affinity Designer. If you found this lesson useful, then consider checking out my Affinity Designer Masterclass. It's a collection of over 60 videos where I go over all of the tools and features in Affinity Designer and I explain what they are and demonstrate how they work. Kind of like how I did in this video. We even have a private community where you can ask questions and get help from me anytime you want. And best of all, there's no monthly membership fees. You just pay $17 one time and you're in for life. I'll have some information about that down below if you want to check that out. As always, thanks for watching.